11 days. Just 11 days on foot separated the people of Israel from the Promised Land. This is not speculation or legend. This number is given by the Bible itself in the first chapter of Deuteronomy. 11 days in a straight line from Mount Sinai to the southern border of Canaan. A distance a walking column could have covered in a week and a half across desert, but entirely passable terrain. 11 days, and the people would have stood at the gates of their future. Instead of 11 days, 40 years passed. 40 years. An entire generation, every man and every woman over 20 years old, died in the desert, never setting foot on the land God had promised them. Their bones were scattered across the scorching sands of Sinai, from one edge of the desert to the other. Think about that for a moment. The same God who had just crushed the greatest empire of the ancient world with 10 supernatural plagues. The same God who parted the waters of the Red Sea like a curtain. The same God who every morning fed millions of people with bread falling straight from the sky. This God looked at his own people and said, "You will not enter. You will wander. You will die here." Why? This is the first riddle of this story. But there's a second one, even stranger, even more inconvenient for any simple explanation. Despite the sentence pronounced, despite 40 years of wandering through a deadly desert, despite rebellions, sickness, and despair, this same God did not abandon his people for a single day. A pillar of cloud went before them by day. A pillar of fire lit their way by night. Manna continued to fall every morning for exactly 14,600 days in a row. And according to the ancient text of Deuteronomy, throughout all 40 years of wandering in the desert, their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. This does not look like punishment. This looks like something completely different. So, what was it really? In this investigation, we will examine all key sources and versions, from ancient texts to modern historical and archaeological research, and try to understand why an 11-day journey turned into a 40-year trial, and why the answer to this question matters not only to those who lived 3,000 years ago. To understand what happened in the desert, we must first understand what happened before it. For several centuries, according to various researchers' estimates, from 300 to over 400 years, the descendants of Jacob lived in Egypt as slaves. This was not a gradual transformation or an accidental misfortune. A new Egyptian pharaoh, according to the book of Exodus, did not know Joseph, meaning he remembered neither this man's merits nor his people's service to Egypt. And when the Israelites began to multiply, fear turned them first into a state labor force and then into a state threat. They were forced to make bricks under a merciless sun. Their backs were scarred by the whips of overseers. When the work pace slowed, they were denied straw for the bricks, but the quota remained the same. When they complained, they were called lazy, and their task was increased. And when Pharaoh decided there were too many of them, he issued an order that still chills the blood today. Every newborn Hebrew boy was to be thrown into the Nile. For several generations in a row, they were born in chains, lived in chains, died in chains. Historians studying the mechanisms of long-term oppression have long noted one pattern. Centuries of slavery do not just break bodies. They reformat the psyche of an entire people. How a person perceives themselves, authority, safety, and freedom. They teach certain reflexes, obey, Don't stick out. Keep your head down. Don't dream of what is inaccessible to you. These reflexes are passed down from generation to generation, not out of malice, but simply because they help one survive. They cannot be erased in a few days, in a few years, or even in one generation. This must be understood at the very beginning of our story, because it is this psychological reality that will become Israel's main adversary in the desert. Not Egyptian troops, not Canaanite giants, but the Egypt that remained inside the people themselves. Then came an intervention that changed everything. God chose Moses, a Hebrew infant saved in a woven basket on the Nile, adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the palace, who fled to the desert after killing an Egyptian overseer, and finally called back through a burning but unconsumed bush. The revelation at the burning bush became a turning point in history. God said to Moses, "I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their pain, and I have come to deliver them." And he did. 10 plagues fell upon Egypt, one after another. Researchers studying the biblical narrative in its historical context have long noted that each of the 10 plagues was directed against a specific Egyptian deity. The Nile turned to blood, a blow against the god Hapi, guardian of the great river. Frogs overran the country, a mockery of the goddess Hecate. Darkness covered the land for 3 days, a blow against the sun god Ra, whom Egyptians considered the highest of gods and the guarantor of the world's very existence. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, took the life of Pharaoh's own son, considered the living embodiment of the god Horus. This was not just a demonstration of power. It was a systematic, sequential, public refutation of the entire Egyptian religious system. Every morning, Egyptians woke up in a world where their gods had saved them from nothing. Pharaoh broke. "Leave," he said. "Take your people and go." And that night, the night of Passover, millions of Israelites left Egypt. They left carrying gold and silver, voluntarily given to them by the Egyptians. They left under the protection of God, who had just brought the most powerful state of the then world to its knees. But here's what almost no one notices in this triumphant exodus. They left Egypt, but Egypt did not leave them. Remember this formulation. It explains everything that will happen next. A few days of freedom and the first test. Pharaoh changed his mind. He sent his army after the departing, 600 select chariots, cavalry, infantry, the best of the most formidable military machine of the ancient world. The Israelites found themselves trapped between the advancing army and the waters of the Red Sea. Behind, a rising cloud of dust from rushing chariots, thunder of hooves, clang of iron. Ahead, only water. There was no way out. And what did they say? "Were there no graves in Egypt that you have brought us to die in the desert? We told you, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians. It would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." They had been free for only a few days, mere days, and already they were rewriting history as if 400 years of whips, drowned infants, and slave labor were preferable to a single moment of uncertainty. This is not a peculiarity of the ancient Israelites. This is a feature of the human psyche, well known to historians and psychologists in all eras. We tend to romanticize the captivity we know because unknown freedom frightens us more than familiar pain. We choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar opportunities again and again, because the familiar is at least understandable, while the incomprehensible feels like a threat. But God did not respond with reproach. Moses raised his staff. A powerful east wind howled all night, and by morning the sea was divided in two. 2 walls of water stood like ramparts on either side, and between them, dry ground. An entire people walked on foot across the seabed: men, women, children, the elderly, livestock, everyone, step by step, between walls of water. When the Egyptian army rushed in pursuit, God released the waters. Every chariot, every horse, every soldier disappeared within minutes. The greatest army on the planet ceased to exist. Israel erupted in jubilation. They sang, danced. Miriam took up her tambourine. It was the greatest day in their history. But the Red Sea was not just salvation. It was a final break. When the waters closed over the Egyptian army, they simultaneously closed any possibility of return. The road back to Egypt no longer existed. It lay under the sea. God did not just open a door forward. He sealed the door back forever. And yet, and this is the most astonishing thing, even with the door sealed, even without the physical possibility of return, the people's hearts would spend the next 40 years trying to return to where they no longer were. Pharaoh at the bottom of the sea was dead, but the Pharaoh in their heads remained alive. This is the fundamental difference between liberating the body and liberating the mind. The body can be led out of slavery in one night. To lead slavery out of a person requires something completely different. 3 days, exactly 3 days of gratitude lasted after the miracle at the Red Sea. On the 3rd day, the Israelites came to a place called Marah. There was water there, but bitter, unfit to drink. And immediately, instantly, accusations against Moses began. What shall we drink? No prayer, no reminder God just parted the sea for us. No attempt to pause and trust. Only complaints and accusations. God responded again with patience, showing Moses a piece of wood. Thrown into the water, it made it sweet. The crisis passed. A lesson was offered. But was the lesson learned? A month and a half later, new grumbling, this time about food, and the words they spoke still strike with their bluntness. If only we had died in Egypt when we sat by pots of meat and ate bread to the full. You have brought us out into this desert to starve us all to death. They romanticized slavery, spoke of pots of meat in Egypt as if they had feasted at Pharaoh's table. But they were slaves. Slaves were not served lavish meals. Human memory works in a peculiar way. When the present is unbearable, the past is rewritten in a more favorable light. The longer a difficult period lasts, the more golden what came before seems, even if before was slavery. God could have responded with anger again. Instead, he responded with bread. In the evening, flocks of quail descended on the camp, and in the morning, when the dew lifted, the ground was covered with something no one had seen before. Thin, white flakes, sweet to the taste, like wafers with honey. What is it? The people asked. And so it was named manna, bread from heaven. Every morning for 40 years, manna appeared on the ground. Each family gathered exactly as much as they needed for one day. If they tried to store it for later, by morning it would rot and swarm with worms. If they gathered too little, it was still enough. If too much, exactly what was needed remained. This was not just sustenance. This was a daily lesson in trust. Every morning they had to believe God would provide again. Faith could not be stored for later. Grace could not be accumulated for a rainy day. They had to go out each day and trust anew. Moses later explained this in the book of Deuteronomy. God humbled you, let you hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. In Egypt, bread was given by Pharaoh. A person worked for him, earned food, depended on an earthly master for survival. In the desert, bread was given by heaven. It was impossible to earn. It simply appeared every morning. God systematically dismantled the slave economy in their minds and replaced it with another logic. You do not earn my love. You receive it anew each morning. There was also something in the story of manna that confounds any usual logic. When the Israelites tried to store it, it rotted. But on Friday, when God commanded them to gather a double portion for the Sabbath day of rest, the extra supply remained perfectly fresh. The same manna, the same conditions, different results. Obedience preserves what fear and distrust destroy. When God says to store, it is preserved. When a person tries to store out of fear and distrust, it rots in their hands. Thousands of years later, when the tempter in the Judean desert tempted Jesus precisely with food to turn stones into bread, Jesus responded with the exact words from Deuteronomy, "Man shall not live by bread alone." The manna was not merely sustenance for an ancient people. According to theologians and Old Testament scholars, it pointed to something greater, to the one who would call himself the bread of life. But the complaints did not cease. At Rephidim they quarreled again over water. Moses cried out to God, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." God commanded him to strike the rock with his staff. Water flowed. Another miracle, another unlearned opportunity. Then came the first battle of the free people against the Amalekites. While Joshua and his army fought on the plain, Moses stood on the hilltop with his hands raised to the sky. When his hands were raised, Israel prevailed. When they dropped from weariness, Amalek prevailed. Then Aaron and Hur stood on either side of Moses and held his hands up until sunset. Victory did not depend on the size of the army. It depended on the posture of the leader and the support of the community. No one wins alone, not in war, not in life. And then came Sinai. And here history takes a turn that would determine everything. 3 months after the exodus from Egypt, the people approached the foot of Mount Sinai. The mountain trembled. Smoke billowed from its summit as from the mouth of a furnace. Lightning split the sky. The sound of a trumpet, not human, unlike anything else, grew louder and louder until the entire camp shook. The people begged Moses, "Let God speak only with you, and not with us directly, lest we die." The very presence was unbearable. This is an important detail. They were not afraid of Sinai. They were afraid of proximity. They were willing to observe God from afar, but not ready to stand before him face to face. And it was this distance, psychological, not physical, that would become the root of all their subsequent troubles. And God spoke aloud to an entire nation. He gave the 10 Commandments. Pay attention to how he began, not with a demand, with a reminder. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. First, salvation, then the law. First, deliverance, then the response to it. This is always his order. He does not say, "Obey me and I will save you." He says, "I have already saved you. Now, this is how to live." The 10 Commandments were not a condition for acceptance, but a guide for those already accepted. Not a ladder upward to God, but a map for life near him. Moses went up the mountain to receive the stone tablets and detailed instructions for the tabernacle, the sacred tent in which God would physically dwell among his people. He was gone for 40 days, and in those 40 days, everything collapsed. The people came to Aaron, Moses' brother, the high priest, and said, "Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And Aaron, in what historians and theologians unanimously call the most staggering leadership failure in the entire Old Testament, collected their golden earrings, melted them down, and cast a golden calf, a statue, an idol, and the people began to dance around it and exclaim, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Stop. Just stop and think about what is happening here. These people saw the 10 plagues with their own eyes, walked through the parted Red Sea on dry ground, ate bread fallen from heaven every morning, heard the voice of God from Mount Sinai so clearly that they begged him not to speak to them like that again, stood at the foot of a mountain that literally shook and smoked from God's presence. And in 6 weeks, they melted their jewelry into the shape of a cow and began to worship it. This moment shatters one of our most deeply held beliefs, that if people see enough evidence, they will believe. That if they witness enough miracles, they will remain faithful. The quantity of miracles does not produce faith. Miracles do not transform the heart. One can see God part the sea on Monday and cast an idol for oneself on Tuesday. Because the problem was never a lack of evidence. The problem was the condition of the heart. And note the choice of image. The Israelites did not invent a new god. They made a calf, the sacred bull of Egypt, Apis, associated with the goddess Hathor, the gods among whom they grew up in slavery. When the pressure became unbearable, when the waiting dragged on, they did not reach for something new. They reached back to the old, the Egyptian, the familiar. This is what makes the golden calf such a devastating event. It was not just idolatry. It was regression. It was proof that even standing in the shadow of Mount Sinai, while the smoke of God's presence still hung over their heads, the pull toward Egypt, toward the old identity, toward the old gods and the old mindset, was stronger than the pull toward freedom. When Moses came down and saw the calf, he shattered the stone tablets on the ground. The covenant was broken before it could be sealed. God called them a stiff-necked people, like a stubborn bull refusing to accept the yoke. But through Moses' intercession, God did not destroy them. He forgave. The tablets were written anew. The covenant was renewed. But the pattern was established. This people needed not just miraculous deliverance from Egypt. They needed a complete internal restructuring. And such restructuring does not happen in a day, a week, or even a year. Here we come to the turning point, to the single event that turned an 11-day journey into a 40-year sentence. And here it is appropriate to recall the central mystery of our investigation. Why did God, who had repeatedly proven his power, allow one decision made at the southern border of the Promised Land to cost an entire generation 40 years? What was so serious about this decision? Historians and theologians have offered various answers to this question. Some emphasized the legal aspect. The people broke the covenant. God carried out the stated consequences. Others saw in it a pedagogical decision. Without 40 years of preparation, the new generation was doomed to repeat the mistakes of their parents. Still others saw in this event something paradoxical. The fate of an entire generation was perhaps the most honest answer God could give to their own choice. For they themselves said they wanted to die in the wilderness, and he took their words seriously. All these versions exist in the scholarly literature, and all contain part of the truth. 2 years after leaving Egypt, the Israelites come to Kadesh Barnea at the southern border of the Promised Land. They could see its outline on the horizon. The goal was right before them. Moses sent 12 scouts, one from each tribe, to explore Canaan. They were gone for 40 days. When they returned, they brought a cluster of grapes so enormous that 2 grown men had to carry it on a pole between them. Imagine this scene. 2 men walking, bent under the weight, and between them on a wooden pole, a single cluster of grapes. They also brought pomegranates and figs. For a people who had eaten only manna for 2 years, this was a tangible, juicy, weighty argument. The Promised Land is not a fairy tale. It is real, it is rich, and it is right here, nearby. The land is good, the scouts reported. It truly flows with milk and honey. But then came the word that destroyed an entire generation. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large, and we saw the descendants of Anak there, giants. Pay attention to the most crucial detail. All 12 scouts agreed that the land was good. Each of them saw the grapes, the milk and honey. The facts were not disputed. What divided them was not what they saw. What divided them was how they interpreted what they saw. 10 scouts looked at the evidence and saw defeat. 2 looked at the same evidence and saw victory. The same land, the same giants, the same God. Completely different conclusions. Because the difference was never in the data, it was in the lens of perception. And the lens was determined by who they believed themselves to be. 10 of the 12 scouts uttered words that reveal the depth of their broken self-perception. We were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Grasshoppers. After all God had done, they looked at themselves and saw insects. This was not a military assessment. It was an identity crisis. They did not say, "The giants are too strong for God." They said, "We are too small." 400 years of slavery had convinced them they were nothing, and no amount of miracles was sufficient to change that belief. Because the belief did not live in their heads, it lived at the very core of their being. It was part of who they felt they were from birth. Only 2 scouts, Joshua and Caleb, saw differently. The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land, they said. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into this land. Do not fear the people of the land. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. The people's reaction? They wanted to stone Joshua and Caleb. They wanted to kill the only 2 men speaking the truth. And then they uttered the words that sealed their fate. Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Back to Egypt. After the plagues, after the Red Sea, after the manna, after the voice of God from Mount Sinai. They wanted to choose a new leader and return to slavery. And then God said, "How long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them?" This is not the voice of an angry tyrant. This is the voice of a heart-broken father. How many more seas must I part? How many more miracles must I perform? How many more morning breads from heaven before you trust me? And then the sentence was pronounced. None of those who saw my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. In this wilderness your bodies shall fall. Your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and shall bear the penalty of your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years. 1 year for each day of scouting. The math is devastating in its symmetry. But here begins the most important part of our investigation. Why exactly like this? What lies behind this judgment? The superficial answer, God punished them for disobedience, is correct but incomplete. This story has several layers that most people never see, and each of these layers reveals something new about the nature of the event itself. The first layer, identity crisis. Centuries of slavery broke not only bodies, they broke how these people perceived themselves. They could not conquer the land because they could not imagine themselves as conquerors. They looked at the giants and felt like insects. This was not cowardice in the usual sense of the word. This was a people psychologically shattered by centuries of oppression to such an extent that they literally could not imagine themselves as anything but victims. And no external miracle could instantly change what had been built up over centuries from within. God could not deprogram 400 years from the minds of that generation. But He could raise up an entirely new generation, born in the wilderness, fed by heavenly bread, knowing not a single day of slavery, and give it an identity unclouded by the memory of chains. The second layer, the danger of a particular kind of unbelief. It is important to understand, Israel was judged not for ignorance, not for not knowing God. The judgment came because they knew God, saw His power with their own eyes, and still refused to trust Him. This is a fundamentally different category. The most dangerous unbelief is not that which comes from ignorance. The most dangerous unbelief is the unbelief of one who has encountered God again and again, repeatedly seen His action, and still says, "But what if it doesn't work out? But what if the giants are stronger? But what if this time He doesn't protect us?" The third layer,
God protected Israel from Israel itself. A nation of former slaves, psychologically broken and spiritually immature, thrown into battle against hardened Canaanite warriors. That is not a conquest. It would have been a slaughter. At the first serious resistance, they would have panicked. At the first failure, they would have capitulated and surrendered or scattered into the desert. Some researchers of biblical texts suggest that the 40 years of wandering were, in a sense, an act of protection, not just punishment. Sometimes a denial, which feels like rejection, is actually protection. Sometimes a delay, perceived as punishment, is preparation. Sometimes God does not let you enter the promised land, not because He has forgotten it, but because He knows you are not yet the person capable of living in it. The fourth layer, the lesson of daily dependence. Manna did not fall because Israel was in the desert. It fell to teach them something specific. Life comes from the Word of God, not from the land. In Egypt, they depended on Pharaoh. In the desert, they learned to depend on God. And this lesson could not be learned in a classroom. It had to be lived day after day, year after year, decade after decade, until new reflexes replace the old ones. The fifth layer is the most countercultural: the danger of prosperity. Moses directly warned the new generation in the book of Deuteronomy. When you have eaten and are full, and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and your silver and your gold multiply, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God. The desert taught Israel that it is easier to seek God when you have nothing than when you have everything. Deprivation drives us to our knees. Prosperity lulls our dependence on Him. The desert removed all distractions, all false sources of security, all competing attachments, and left Israel alone with God. And that was the entire design. The sixth layer extends beyond Israel, into the space of the prophetic. The number 40 is never accidental in the biblical text. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. The prophet Elijah walked 40 days to Mount Horeb. Nineveh was given 40 days for repentance. Jesus fasted 40 days before the start of His ministry. The number 40 in Scripture is always a threshold, a period of testing and transformation preceding something new. Israel's 40-year journey through the desert was in this sense not only a historical event, but also a prophetic pattern, a template that would repeat in the history of salvation, and would ultimately point to that very testing in the Judean desert, where Jesus faced the same temptations that Israel could not withstand, and triumphed where they fell. Now let's examine what actually happened during those 40 years, because most people imagine 40 years of silence, 40 years of God's absence, God turned away and gone. Nothing could be further from the truth. The pillar of cloud never left. For 40 years, every day, a visible manifestation of God's presence hung over the camp. The cloud by day, protection from the scorching desert sun, which could kill a person in a few hours. The fire by night, light in the darkness of the desert, where the temperature dropped sharply. When the cloud moved, they broke camp and moved. When it stopped, they stopped and pitched their tents. Every day, all they had to do was look up. And there He was, God. He is here. He did not leave. The manna did not cease. For 40 years, God prepared breakfast for an entire nation. Every morning, without exception, bread appeared on the ground. In a desert where nothing grows, millions of people ate every day. This is not rejection. This is relentless, stubborn, daily faithfulness, independent of the behavior of those to whom it is shown. And here is a detail that is almost impossible to believe. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 4. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Their sandals lasted 40 years. Their clothes did not tear. 4 decades in a harsh desert, and the ordinary laws of wear and decay were simply suspended.
Think what this meant in practice. Every time they looked at their souls, every time they put on a cloak, they wore a miracle on their bodies, a living, tangible reminder. God did not forget them, even in the small things. Now, the scale. Researchers estimate the population of the Israelite camp in the desert at 1.5 to 2 million people. To feed such a number in the desert, the daily manna must have covered a vast area. Providing water, food, and organization for a moving city of that size under conditions where survival was fundamentally impossible without external intervention. This in itself defies ordinary historical analogy. This was not a small nomadic band under the open sky. It was one of the largest organized communities of the ancient world, kept in existence solely by the hand of God. And God did this every day, without a single omission. 14,600 days in a row. This is not the behavior of a God who has turned away from his people. This is the behavior of a God who is obsessively, relentlessly, stubbornly faithful, even when people do not deserve it, even when they complain about the very manna with which he feeds them, even when they accuse him of trying to kill them precisely in the place where he keeps them alive. But there were also terrible moments, testimonies that God is not indifferent to what happens in people's hearts. The rebellion of Korah. 250 elders challenged the authority of Moses, and the earth opened up and swallowed them alive. Fiery serpents were sent when the people grumbled once again, though God also provided healing, a bronze serpent on a pole, which one only had to look upon to survive. Centuries later, Jesus would point precisely to this bronze symbol as an image of his own crucifixion. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And there was the tragic failure of Moses himself. At the waters of Meribah, when the people again demanded water, God told Moses to speak to the rock. But Moses, in a moment of exhaustion and rage, struck it with his staff and shouted, "Listen, you rebels! Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" Water gushed forth, but God said, "Because you did not believe in me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, you shall not bring this people into the land which I have given them." Moses, who stood before Pharaoh. Moses, who ascended Sinai and spoke with God face to face. Moses, who again and again interceded for the people when God wanted to destroy them. Even he would not enter the promised land. One moment of misplaced anger, one instant when he took upon himself what belonged to God, and the greatest leader in Israel's history lost the right to finish his work. This tells us 2 things. First, God holds leaders to a higher standard because their actions represent him to others. Second, no one is above the consequences of their decisions. Year after year, the old generation passed away. One by one, they were buried in the sand.
And as they passed away, something new emerged. Their children, born in tents, raised on manna, knowing no life other than the desert and the God who kept them alive in it, grew up to be people of a fundamentally different character. They had no memories of Egypt, no nostalgia for Pharaoh's pots, no inner Pharaoh whispering that slavery was safer. They grew up watching God's cloud move ahead of them. They grew up gathering heavenly bread every morning. They grew up knowing in the very core of their being that every breath they took was granted by the hand of God. This was the entire design. God could not deprogram 400 years of slavery from the minds of the parents, but he could write something completely different into the hearts of the children. The desert was not a wasteland. It was an incubator, a place where a new people was formed, with a new memory, new reflexes, and a new identity. Where the parents saw a threat, the children saw an ordinary day. Where the parents flinched at the memory of Egyptian taskmasters, the children knew only the cloud and fire of God overhead. It was this difference in experience, accumulated over 40 years, that created completely different people, not inherently better, not more righteous, but shaped by a different context. The desert was not a punishment for the old. It was a school for the new. In the desert, Israel learned community. The tabernacle stood at the center of the camp, and the 12 tribes were arranged around it in a strict order. They moved together, pitched camp together, worshipped together. There was no place for individualism in the desert. Survival was possible only together, or not at all. When a person knows their survival is linked to the survival of the community, it forges a special kind of solidarity that cannot be created in any other way. And this communal identity, forged in shared hardship, became the foundation of the people they were building. In the desert, Israel learned to hear the voice of God. In Egypt, they were surrounded by noise, the gods of Egypt, the culture of Pharaoh, the values of an empire built on slave labor. In the desert, all of this was stripped away like an old layer of plaster. Only silence remained. And in that silence, God spoke. The prophet Hosea, writing centuries later, captured this remarkably accurately. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak to her heart. God uses the desert to speak, to make his voice the only voice, so that a person stops hearing the noise of everything else and begins to hear what is important. In the desert, Israel learned his timing. And this is perhaps the most difficult lesson of all. We live in a world of the instant. Instant messages, instant answers, instant gratification of any desire. But God does not work on our schedule. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, he said through Isaiah. Sometimes the longest road is the only road that will get you there as the right person. Sometimes a delay is not punishment, but preparation that makes the goal itself achievable. Sometimes 40 years in the desert is not wasted time, but the only way to become what one needs to be. 40 years later, the picture had completely changed. Moses stands on the plains of Moab. He is 120 years old. He looks across the Jordan River at the land of Canaan. The generation that came out of Egypt is gone. Every single one buried in the desert, exactly as God had said. Before Moses stands a new people, hardened by the desert, shaped by dependence on God. Ready. Moses delivers his final word,
The book of Deuteronomy, one of the most powerful farewell speeches in human history. He reminds them of everything: the plagues, the sea, the manna, the golden calf, Kadesh Barnea, the 40 years. Not to awaken guilt, so that they would remember where they came from. And he warns, when the Lord your God brings you into the land, do not say in your heart, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. It is not for your merits. It is for his promise and his grace. Then came a moment that is difficult to read without a lump in the throat. God brought Moses to the top of Mount Nebo and showed him the entire promised land, from north to south, from west to east, the hills of Galilee, the forests of Lebanon, the shimmering Dead Sea in the distance, the green Jordan Valley below. 40 years of walking, and there it was, all in one glance. Everything he had worked for, everything he had suffered for, everything he had believed in, but he is not allowed to set foot there. Imagine yourself standing on a mountain peak and seeing the fulfillment of your life's purpose spread out before you like a painting, and knowing your feet will never touch it. Imagine leading millions of people through unimaginable trials for 40 years and being told, this is as far as you go. The Bible says that Moses' sight did not weaken and his strength did not fail. He did not die from old age or illness. He was as strong as before. But God said, it is time, and Moses obeyed. For the last time, obeyed. The greatest leader in Israel's history died there on the mountain, with the promised land filling his entire view, and God himself buried him in a grave that no one ever found. As if God wanted to say, this one is mine. Israel mourned Moses for 30 days, and then it was time to move. Leadership passed to Joshua, one of the 2 faithful scouts, the man who 40 years ago stood in Kadesh Barnea and said, we can. God is with us. For 40 years, Joshua waited for this hour. He watched everyone around him die. He continued to believe when there were no visible grounds for belief, except one, the Word of God. And now the hour had come. God's words to Joshua echo through the ages. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. When Joshua led the people to the Jordan River, it parted, exactly as the Red Sea parted 40 years earlier. The new generation walked on dry ground, just as their parents had. But this time, they did not look back. The manna ceased the very next day. For 40 years bread fell from heaven, and suddenly, without warning, it stopped. Because there was no longer any need for it. They were in the land. The time of preparation was over. The time of possession had begun. Heavenly sustenance yielded to earthly abundance, as soon as the desert had fulfilled its task. And this new generation did what their parents lacked the courage to do. They fought. They conquered. City by city, battle by battle, not because they were physically stronger, not because they were more skilled as warriors, but because they had been forged by the desert, because they knew who their God was, because they had no Egypt to return to, and no Pharaoh in their heads telling them they were slaves. Now we must tell about a man named Caleb, because his story is perhaps the most inspiring in this narrative. Caleb was one of the 2 faithful scouts in Kadesh Barnea. When everyone said, we cannot, Caleb said, we certainly can. For this faith, God preserved his life. But Caleb still had to wander 40 years in the desert alongside the generation that failed. Not for his own disbelief, for someone else's. He watched his contemporaries die one after another, year after year. He buried them. He continued to live, continued to believe, continued to wait. 40 years. When the conquest finally began, Caleb was 85 years old. 85. Most people at that age seek rest. Caleb sought battle. He came to Joshua and said words that still catch the breath today. Give me this mountain. Not a valley, not a plain, not a piece of land from which someone has already cleared the way. He wanted precisely this mountain, that specific mountain where giants lived, those very sons of Anak who 40 years ago terrified the other scouts. And he added, I am still as strong today as I was on the day Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so it is now, for war and for going out and coming in. 40 years in the desert did not weaken Caleb. They forged him. While the unbelieving generation perceived those years as a death sentence, Caleb perceived them as preparation. The same desert, the same years, a completely different result. Because the difference was never in the desert. The difference was in the heart. And Caleb received his mountain. He conquered it at 85 years old, at an age when most people no longer believe that anything important can still happen. The mountain with giants fell before a man who did not allow the desert to kill his faith. This story poses one question to everyone from which there is no escape. Are you in a desert now? Perhaps you have been there for a long time. Perhaps you feel forgotten. Perhaps you prayed and nothing changed. Perhaps you look around and see only sand and silence and ask yourself, does God even remember me? He remembers. Perhaps your desert is waiting for a door to open, waiting for a prayer to be answered, waiting for something to change that has not changed for so long that you have almost stopped believing it will ever change. Perhaps your desert is loss of a loved one, loss of a dream, loss of the life you expected to have. Perhaps it is loneliness, illness, failure, or that oppressive feeling that everyone else has crossed their Jordan while you are still stuck in the sand. Perhaps you are bearing the consequences of someone else's choice, like Caleb, who had to wander 40 years in the desert for the refusal of a generation that refused, not for his own. If this is so, Caleb's story was written specifically for you. Faithfulness in someone else's desert does not vanish. It builds precisely the character you will need when your hour comes to take your mountain. Except one thought. Every desert has an expiration date. 40 years is the longest desert in the Bible, and even it ended. The Jordan parted. The manna ceased because there was no longer any need for it. The land of milk and honey was real, and the people who survived the desert entered it. Your desert is not forever, but what you do in the desert determines what you will take from it. Caleb took strength. The complainers took nothing. They did not even emerge alive. And here's what is especially important in this comparison. Caleb was not spared from the desert. He went through exactly the same 40 years as everyone else. He saw the same stones, breathed the same dust, slept under the same stars. It was also hard for him. Nevertheless, the outcome of his life in the desert turned out diametrically opposite to the outcome of most. The same desert gave death to some, strength to another. The difference was not in the circumstances. The difference was in what the person did with his circumstances inside himself. Caleb used every year of waiting to become stronger. Every morning with manna he rose not with complaint, but with gratitude. Every new journey he made, not as a prisoner serving a sentence, but as a warrior preparing for his hour. The manna still falls. The cloud is still here. Your sandals have not worn out. God is not punishing you. He is preparing you. The desert is not the destination. It is a training ground. It is the place where God removes everything non-essential. All illusions of self-sufficiency, all attachments to what cannot serve as support, all noise that drowns out the quiet voice, so that only one thing remains: you and Him. This is precisely what cannot be done in prosperity and comfort. This is precisely what cannot be inherited. It can only be lived. But here is what you must decide. Will you be the first generation or the second? Will you spend your desert years in grumbling, looking back, longing for the pots of Egypt, for that familiar pain which is at least predictable? Or will you be like Caleb? Use the waiting to grow, deepening trust, becoming the person who is able to enter the promised land and truly possess it. This is not a rhetorical question. It is a choice made not once, but every day. Every morning when you wake up in the desert, you decide to grumble about the manna or gather it with gratitude, to look at the cloud or look at your feet, to wait for your hour or waste energy trying to return to where you cannot return. The difference between 11 days and 40 years was never distance. It was the heart. Finally, one image worth remembering. When Joshua led the people through the Jordan, God commanded him to choose 12 men who would take 12 stones from the riverbed and place them on the shore. A monument, a pile of stones. Not a statue, not a column, not a palace, just stones. And God explained why. So that when your children ask tomorrow what these stones are, you can say, "Here God brought us through." Someday you will look back on this period of your life, on this desert, this waiting, this struggle, and you will lay your own stones. You will tell someone, "Here He held me. Here He fed me when I had nothing. Here He carried me when I could not walk. Here I learned to trust Him. Here He was faithful, even when I was not faithful to Him." Your desert is not the end of the story. It is the chapter that makes everything after it possible. The God who brought you out of your Egypt is the same God who will bring you into your promised land. The God who fed you with manna in the desert is the same God who has milk and honey waiting for you on the other side. The God who was with you in the fire at night is the same God who will fight for you in the light of day. 3,000 years have passed since the first people walked this path, but something has not changed. Deserts still exist. People still complain about the manna they receive. People still look back at the Egypt from which they were brought out. And people still stand at the threshold of their Kadesh Barnea, looking at the promised land and say, "We are like grasshoppers. We cannot succeed." But also, Calebs still exist. People who lived 40 years in the desert and at 85 ask for their mountain. People who allowed waiting to make them stronger, not break them.
People who at the end of the journey look at the distance traveled and lay their stones, not from bitterness, but from gratitude. 40 years of manna every morning. 40 years of cloud by day and fire by night. 40 years of clothing that did not wear out. 40 years of presence, constant, faithful, stubborn, unwavering presence. Even when his people grumbled and complained and asked to return to chains. If God was so faithful to a people who tested him 10 times, he will be faithful to you. If God did not give up on Israel in the desert, he will not give up on you in yours. Even in the desert, God satisfies. Even in waiting, God supplies. Even in silence, God speaks. And beyond your desert, a land flowing with milk and honey, with your name on it. Do not die in the desert, looking back at Egypt. Cross the Jordan. Take the mountain. Your 40 years can end.